Shit. What's up, y'all? Sparty here. Now, for this video, I want to talk Sony Xperia 1 Mark III. Almost a year in. Now, I got this in like October, November. So, it's like, what? 7-8 months that I've been with this phone. And I want to talk about it and how overall it's been faring me since I've obviously had it. So, yeah. Especially with things like the 1 Mark IV coming out. What the hell? I do indeed want to talk a couple of things when it comes to how I feel about moving from Sony to LG and all this other stuff. So, even though I have made a separate video talking about that, I want to go into a little bit more depth here just to talk about how the 1 Mark III has been treating me overall, if I'm overall planning to move to the 1 Mark IV and things like that. So, yeah, let's get to it. So, let's talk about the things that a lot of people will criticize about this phone and whether or not they're deal breakers for me. The battery being 4,500 milliamp hours, and with the phone screen being a 4K 120Hz display, how does that overall make the battery fare? I've said this from the beginning when I did my comparison between the 1 Mark III and the S22 Ultra. I literally said that they get pretty much the same battery life. And I feel like that's something that's pretty nice. 7.5 hours, sometimes even 8 hours of screen on time if I'm doing nothing but watching YouTube. So to me, that's something that's very nice and what a lot of people tend to overlook. If you're doing just one thing, I wouldn't expect the battery to go down all that quick, aggressively quick. But say if you're doing multiple things throughout the day, you're doing a lot of mixed usage, I still don't think you're going to have that much of an issue with this phone day to day. Since this is my daily driver, I do use this for work like 40 to 48 hours a week. So this phone has literally been very good for things like that, listening to podcasts while at work and stuff like that, doing a little bit of like Twitter browsing and all this other stuff. It is indeed been a very good. Now, is it on the level of like a V60? Not necessarily, but due to the fact that I don't get 5G with this phone, since this is an international unit, I feel like that's helped a little bit in terms of like the battery life and overall longevity of the battery itself. I do plan on keeping this for the next couple years just to test Sony's claims about how their batteries stay healthy for a long period of time. So I do plan on doing that, but I will say so far, I've had no issues. I get to work, it's at like 98% battery. I leave work, it's on like 65% battery. I think that's more than enough for me personally. Getting off work 8 hours a day. Really no issue with that whatsoever. Let's talk about things like the screen. The screen, especially compared to the 1 Mark I and the 1 Mark II, is definitely brighter from what I've heard from other people that have had those phones. I can't attest to that because obviously this is my first flagship Sony phone. But I will say this, the screen's great. The brightness gets just bright enough for me personally, even outdoors, even in direct sunlight. It was very sunny today, and I honestly had no problem for like very minimal usage looking at my screen and seeing things I needed to see. I feel like the phone did a very good job at making sure I can actually see the screen. So it's not a deal breaker for me that it's not as bright as, say, my V60 or an S22 Ultra. Or not S22 Ultra, S21 Ultra. That's something that I really don't think has been that big of a deal for me personally. There are a couple times where I'm like, yeah, I would like the screen to be brighter, and that might be a reason why I go to the 1 Mark IV. but ultimately I don't necessarily see it as a deal breaker. I personally think it gets bright enough. And as you guys can see here, it's definitely not a dim screen whatsoever. But obviously, since I'm indoors, it should be that way. Let's talk about things like the fingerprint sensor. This is something that a lot of people do have issues with, and I've had a couple issues with it because of there are a few instances where I will get misreads, and I will have to put in my PIN to get into my phone. It happens a little bit more often than I would like it to, but overall, it's not really a deal breaker. And when I am using the phone and, unlocking it and getting into it when I need to, and that doesn't happen, the fingerprint sensor on this phone is very fast, it's very responsive, it's very quick, and I really don't have any sort of issue with that. The Google Assistant button honestly gets very little, if any, use. The only time I do it is when I decide to set an alarm. Say if I'm like, set an alarm for 4 a.m.
Tomorrow at 4 a.m. set.
Then that's what I do for work, obviously. But for the One Mark IV, I really do like how they're taking it away because it's really not needed, honestly. It kind of gets in the way a lot of the time, and sometimes it does end up getting triggered in my pocket, depending on the case. Like, as you guys can see, you see how raised the button for the Google Assistant button is raised on this case. Sometimes it gets hit. It won't always trigger. Like, say if you just press it, it doesn't trigger, but you got to press and hold it. But also, it's easier, say, if you just have the regular nav buttons, or if you have the gestures, it's easier to just do that, and you really have no issue with that. For me, I really don't have an issue with that for me personally. Let's talk about 21:9 and how tall this phone is. A lot of people get turned off by this because it may be too narrow for them. As you guys can see, I have pretty big hands, so it's not really that big of a deal. For some things, it is a bit difficult to reach, but not enough for me to say that the phone is unusable or anything like that. It's fairly comfortable in my hand. I really like how the ergonomics of the phone overall, especially if you're using the camera and you just go into it like that and you use it like this. The phone does a very good job at making a lot of operations very fast and snappy. And that's kind of what the One series has been about since the beginning, is making sure that you get a lot of things done as quick as possible, whether it be for things like video recording or camera, taking pictures and things like that. This phone is stupendously fast when it comes to things like that. The eye autofocus and all that other stuff is insane. And it makes things like, I'll show you guys, I put it in my community tab so you can see it there too, but I'll also show you guys here, if I can find it. This was a picture of my friend's lizard that I took on the S21 Ultra. I gave it to him, but I ended up having to sell it. Might end up giving him this phone or like a 5 Mark III. And as you guys can see, it's sharpened to hell. It's hazy. It looks bad, right? It doesn't look good at all, in my personal opinion. So let me go to the picture that the One Mark III took. Look at the focus on that eye. People complained about the softness of the One Mark III's telephoto lens, right? And this thing, I will say that is very nice. Yes, it's soft, and the moment you zoom in, you do get a little bit of like softness, but I don't necessarily think it's that bad. This picture looks great. And that's something that is very nice. Sony does a very good job with the quickness of this camera and the focusing. I've never had issue with the focusing on this camera at all. It's just been very nice. And overall, I don't necessarily think that them sticking with the 12 megapixel sensor is that bad. Even with the One Mark IV, But I feel next year they really should try to put a larger sensor, in particular the main sensor, into their phone. Because I think it's about time we move on from the triple 12 megapixel setup at some point in time. And I think next year will be the way. Sony is pretty much the king of the 12 megapixel right now. Like, especially with the One Mark IV, where all three lenses do 4K 120. The telephoto 12 megapixel sensor is a continuously zooming sensor. It's a fully mechanical sensor rather than the dual stage that's on here, which is still pretty nice. I do like that a lot. But also I do feel like they're making a lot of strides in terms of what their hardware can do in such a compact body like this. Because I remember when I held that S21 Ultra again in my hand, that thing was heavy. That was very heavy. This is lightweight. It's not lightweight to the point where I would say it feels cheap, but it definitely doesn't have that heft to it like an S21 Ultra does. And I really do feel like Sony's done a good job at making sure they give you the entire Sony experience. A very powerful phone, a very capable phone, still a very expensive feeling phone, without you feeling like it's cheap. Because there are a lot of phones out there that felt cheap but were expensive, and I don't feel like the One Mark III is that. In terms of like reception and all that stuff, I really don't have any sort of issues. Ultimately, that will depend on your area. But even though this is an international unit, I really haven't had any sort of horrendous reception issues and things like in places like Minneapolis or St. Paul. I have a couple connection issues out here in Chaska when I'm like at work or whatever, but it's not that big of a deal. When I'm at home, I don't have any sort of issues. But overall, I do feel like the One Mark III, international or not, is pretty good with its reception. It's very good with its Wi-Fi reception too. Really don't have any sort of issues with that. Call quality is very good. The loudness of the speakers are very nice. They're clear. Really have no issue with that. The front facing speakers for things like media and YouTube and stuff, they're not the loudest, but I do feel like Sony does a very good job at balancing volume and overall distortion levels, because a lot of other phones will just decide to distort to high hell so long as it's loud, right? That's not what happens with this phone. And honestly, I feel like that's very nice. Obviously, it's very nice to have the 512 gig variant of the One Mark III. It's nice that the One Mark IV just comes like that, and you still get an SD card expansion option. That's something that is very nice. 12 gigs of RAM. I have no issues with RAM on this phone. Gaming, very good on this phone. Probably my favorite gaming phone, right? Phone to game on right now that's not a gaming phone, because the Game Enhancer app does a very good job at giving you different options for things probably that you would want to do. HS Power Control, every game can do that. You can go even deeper. Let's go into a game like, I guess, Contest of Champions. And then you go into your custom game mode. You do the settings right there, and you can literally set it to... You get this phone, or you get a 1 Mark III, a 5 Mark III, or even a 5 Mark II, and you go into the Game Enhancer and enable that black frame insertion, that 240 hertz black frame insertion. This phone is like a cheat code, dog. It's very responsive and very fast, and it's kind of crazy that phones can be this responsive. It's insane. Like, I almost never die in COD Mobile with this phone, whereas it was kind of a little bit of an iffy experience with things like the S21 Ultra. But overall feelings about this phone is I really love it. I still do miss the V60 and a lot of things that it offers. I really do wish the headphone jack was better on Sony phones. I wish they would do a little bit more with the amp on their phones. But overall, I really do feel like they've done a very good job at having a focus for their phones. Very nice overall. I'll probably do a separate video talking about how I feel about the video performance on this phone, because I really haven't talked about that much, but I will get into that in a separate video. This is Sparta. Thanks for watching. Thanks for support. Hope you guys have a wonderful Monday, whatever time of day it is in the area. Like the video if you like it, share with people that are interested in this sort of content, and have a good one.